And I pronounce your last name Witcher.
Witcher, yeah.
Marcus
like
Witcher.
Gosh, that was so bad.
Are you ready, George?
Ready?
Are we live?
We're live.
Welcome, everybody, to the Institute on Religion and Democracy here in Washington, D.C. I am Mark Tooley, president of the Institute, and delighted to host this evening two distinguished speakers with an important new book called Black Liberation Through the Marketplace, copies of which are available for those here physically who would like to procure one. The authors are Rachel Ferguson and Marcus Witcher. Rachel is at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis, a Lutheran seminary.
Well, I'm at Concordia University, Chicago, which
I'm
is
sorry.
related to Concordia Seminary.
You are physically in Chicago.
I'm physically in St. Louis, but I work in Chicago.
Very confusing, but somehow involving Lutheranism. And Marcus Witcher teaches at, I hope I get this right, Huntington College in Montgomery, Alabama, which is at least officially a Methodist-related school. I don't know if they ever tell you that or not, but yes, it is acknowledged. So Rachel will go first with 10 or 15 minutes of reflection about the book, and she will be followed by Marcus. They will conclude within a half hour, and then afterwards there'll be plenty of time for questions and comments. We are broadcasting this conversation live on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and then we will post it later at YouTube. So if you want to go back to catch details you missed the first time around, you are welcome to do so. Rachel, we welcome you and look forward to your comments.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Yes, I'm sorry for the confusion. It's Concordia University, Chicago, and there's actually 6 Concordia undergraduate schools, and the pastoral students there matriculate up into Concordia Seminary. But I do live in St. Louis, very near the seminary, and just spend 1 week per month in Chicago, and I really, really love it. I'm developing a free enterprise center there, and we are a majority-minority school, so it's really wonderful to be thinking through these questions of Black liberation through the marketplace. We're already running into issues that affect Latinos as well in the book, and of course, so many Latino students at my school. And so it's really helping to make classical liberal ideas, the idea of the American project, and the idea of free markets approachable and interesting to students like mine. That's one of the things I want to do with my book. So with our book. And so I will just start by kind of laying out the project. I've already been talking to a few of you about it. Initially I just thought, classical liberals have so much to say to questions of race and discrimination. We actually have really important economic insights in that area, but we are not necessarily associated with that. People don't think, hey, I know who I'm going to ask about racial discrimination in America, the classical liberals. And I wanted to change that. So the initial idea for the book was to actually just gather a lot of those insights together, sort of walk through American history and see what the economists and the classical liberal historians are saying for each important era. But as I began writing the book, it became immediately clear to me that it was going to accomplish another goal as well. I don't know if anyone's noticed, but over the last 5 or 6 years, things have gotten a little tense in our country, a little bit of tribalism, a little bit of polarization, okay, and it's really, really hard. We're living in a very hard cultural moment, I think. It's affecting our personal relationships, it's affecting our work relationships, and as a classical liberal, I've never fit into the two-party system anyway, right? I've always crossed borders. I'm talking about things like criminal justice reform and ending the drug war, and oftentimes I'm talking to progressives about those kinds of things. But I'm also deeply invested in questions about things like family structure, right, which are deeply conservative, and things like the importance of the church as an institution of civil society, which might be more of a concern for conservatives. And so because I've always kind of been in between, I felt, classical liberals really have something to offer here in terms of busting out of this tribal conversation, unbundling topics that have been weirdly bundled together to fit into a party platform. And the other kind of advantage of that is that Black America has never really fit into the majority culture's political parties either. So for instance, while it is the case that Black Americans vote in very high numbers for the Democratic Party, they also tend to be the most centrist of Democrats, very pro-market, very pro-entrepreneurial. Notice that when it was Sanders versus Biden in South Carolina, when the Black vote really counted, it was Biden, not Sanders, right? So there was a rejection of that kind of socialist mentality. You have a lot of social conservatism coming out of the Black church tradition as well. And so you have a kind of uncomfortable marriage there going on politically. And so I can relate to feeling kind of politically homeless. And so we started out the project with really the fundamental question, right, that especially that you're hearing from the left, which is, isn't it the case that slavery is really a form of markets, right? And so in a way, this is a profit-driven endeavor, and it just goes to show that capitalism is at its heart corrupt. And so we go back and we look at Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and the classical economists who led eventually to the neoclassical ones, arguing not only the moral wrong of slavery, but actually the economic foolishness of slavery, showing that whenever you shut out any part of the population from being able to become educated, improve their human capital, move to where their labor is most needed, right? Invent things, trade things with you, you lose out on everything you could have traded with them. So yes, a few will do well, a few aristocratic guys, right? Some slave masters, which is a very small group of people actually in the South, just a few families. They will do well, but the economy itself will not flourish as a result of that kind of a system. And you actually do see some of that. The South is a strong economy in certain ways, like relative to the rest of the world, but it's not nearly as strong as it could have been if it had had free labor. You see white wages bid down by competing with slave labor. You see a lack of infrastructure in the South, using very, very old-fashioned ideas of manual labor when you could have been using steam engines and things like that. So really being very far behind economically and having a lot to catch up on after emancipation. And so we really show that, no, this is not what free markets are about. Free markets are based on the idea of private property, which is property starting with your own body, right, and your own labor. You own your labor, and it's up to you to make deals and sell your labor. And that's called freedom of contract. And so, no, if you do not have property in your own self, acknowledged by the government, if you do not have freedom of contract, if you are not equally protected by just laws, then no, you are not dealing with a free market system here at all. The two things should be untangled from one another. So that's how we start out, kind of starting right at the beginning. And then we look at how emancipation leads to, really a strong desire among African Americans, freedmen, to own their own farms. But that wasn't really possible. Private property rights were not acknowledged by the courts. It was, not a lot of capital going in, no compensation for all of the stolen labor. And so you do see freedmen forced into these sharecropping relationships. However, something that's kind of a hidden gem in history is this book called Competition and Coercion by Robert Higgs, an excellent classical liberal economist. And in this book, he shows there's one precious freedom that the freedmen can use to their own advantage, and that's the freedom to move. So with the freedom to move, you can move from the Deep South to the Upper South, where maybe you'll have more help from white neighbors. You can move from one farm to another farm. And you get into a situation where over time you actually see freedmen able to bid up their shares with sharecropping. And actually the black economy expands at 3 times the rate of the white economy up into 1900. And so they're starting from a very low point. So they're still experiencing a lot of poverty, but you do actually get a majority of black Americans able to have a little bit of extra income actually to spend on something that's not just a total necessity by the time you get to 1900. The other really amazing accomplishment you see during this period is the huge leap forward in literacy. And so, of course, this is coming out of the church, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But, oh my goodness, I mean, Robert Higgs says that it may be the greatest leap forward in literacy in history thus far. And so by 1930, you've gone from basically 0 literacy in the community to 80%, literacy and a real value for education in the Black community that goes just to the core of really, in many ways, their religious life, the love of the Bible, of course. And so from there, we actually move on to Marcus's chapter, so I'm going to wait till you come up for you to talk about that. But I talk about the Black church in chapter 5, and this was actually something we added, right? I remember the day I called Marcus and said, we've got to do a chapter on the Black church. What was I thinking? Not having that in the outline, because the Black church is the cultural womb of Black America. What's so important about it? Well, number one, Black Americans really identified with the concept of the Imago Dei, being made in the image of God. This was hugely moving for them to have this kind of joy. As a matter of fact, some of the revivalists noted that white converts during the revivals would feel really depressed about their sin, and they would be kind of broken down by the idea of having sin. And while the Black converts would also be acknowledging their sin, they were so overjoyed at the idea of having a relationship with the God of the universe, right? That just seemed like such an amazing thing to be saying. And so there was a real joy of being really an equal, knowing that deep down, we are equals. We're brothers and sisters and children of God. And so it was extremely powerful. They identified with the children of Israel under the Pharaoh, right? They identified with the story of Exodus. And that was a powerful dream of freedom for them. And then, of course, they also identified with the prophets who were talking about the way that we treat the voiceless, right? The poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. They're very connected to those passages. As a matter of fact, the Black church to this day is probably pretty more deeply grounded in the Old Testament, perhaps, than a lot of white theology is. It's very interesting. And so what you see there is that some of that split that you see later in the 20th century, or I should say in the early 20th century, that split you see between what we might call the social gospel, right? Concern about how we treat people in society versus sort of where do you go when you die, right? That sort of idea. That kind of split that happened in the white church actually just doesn't happen in the Black church. It doesn't occur to them that that's even possible. How would you divide the two concepts? And so they look at it as almost like foolishness in the white church, which was really interesting for me to discover. And so I just enjoyed so much writing that chapter. I learned an incredible amount. And one of the things I always try to remember to tell people, because it was a surprise to me, is that the term white man's religion actually didn't refer to Christianity as such. It referred to the Christianity of the plantation missionaries who were only allowed to say what the slave master told them to say, which was about stealing, not stealing and obeying your master. And so they called that the white man's religion because it didn't even mention Jesus, right? It was really about the supremacy of their master over themselves. But they were going off on their own into what were called hush harbors to worship in secret. And actually, if they were caught, were badly persecuted oftentimes by their slave masters. So Black slaves were not taking on the religion of their slave masters. Many slave masters were actually kind of unchurched Anglicans, we might say, in the South, not particularly zealous, religiously speaking, but they were actually taking on the evangelical religion of the revivalists. And so it was really their own thing. They were taking that back to the plantation, oftentimes converting one another. One of the best examples of this is Frederick Douglass. If you haven't read his autobiography, please do. It's an absolute classic of American literature. And Frederick Douglass is a very good example of exactly this pattern that we're talking about. Someone who hears the gospel from his friend Uncle Lawson. Uncle Lawson is his discipler. He condemns what he sees as a very hypocritical form of Christianity in the white community, but sees, in a way, himself and the Black churches kind of getting it, right? Getting the real gospel in some sense. So it was really a fascinating thing to understand, and so important for the civil society institutions that emerged later. So I think sometimes when we think of classical liberalism, we think of property, freedom of contract, the rule of just law, right? Markets, we love markets. But what we forget is if you live in a free society and the government's not doing a whole lot, guess who's doing it? Us, right? We're doing it. We're starting clubs, we're starting organizations, right? We're starting churches, we're getting it done. And so we really wanted to emphasize that, not only with the Black church chapter, but Marcus is also going to talk about so many of the other organizations that come out. Later on, we start to get into a more contemporary period. The 20th century was pretty ugly when it came to race, and it actually starts in the progressive era with progressive eugenics. And so many I'm sure some of you are very aware of this, but many Americans are actually quite unaware of just how popular racist, pseudo-scientific eugenics really was in the early 20th century. Presidents, judges, presidents' cabinets, John Maynard Keynes, the great economist, Kellogg, many of these huge entrepreneurs, they were all serious eugenicists, thinking about how we could support the white Aryan head of household and disemploy immigrants, blacks, and women. And so how do we disemploy people so that they can just sort of fade out? Well, one way to do it is to create a minimum wage that's so high that no one will pay them that amount. They'll only pay white Aryan males that amount. And that was actually very explicit. So this isn't like a conspiracy theory that I made up because I don't like the idea of the minimum wage. It's actually totally explicit in economics textbooks that were widely used in 1905 and 1906. Look at the book Illiberal Reformers by Thomas C. Leonard if you want to learn more about it. It's absolutely shocking. Keynes said things like, now that we're dealing with the quantity problem in population, we have to start dealing with the quality problem, right? And who's going to be allowed to reproduce? People were even given what they were called Mississippi appendectomies, which was secretly tying your tubes. This happened to Fannie Lou Hamer. People were sterilized against their will. I mean, really, really crazy stuff, particularly in a free, apparently, society, right? And so we look at the legacy of that in economics, and then we go on to look at some of the just massive federal projects. I think during the Progressive era, there sort of arises kind of an obsession with central planning, right? The idea that we can sort of organize the world. Modern life is becoming very complex, and we need experts, right? We need experts to come in and decide how people should relate to one another. So what many of you may not know is that in the early 20th century, people were not necessarily integrated in terms of like their street, but they were often integrated in their neighborhood. It wasn't uncommon to live near your factory, say, near where you work, and you might have a Polish street, a black street, right? An Irish street. That sort of thing was common in certain cities. But what happened was something like, the Federal Housing Administration's redlining policies, which were specifically made in order to keep white people and black people apart with the idea that they would be more peaceful if they were separate. And so the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure loans in black and integrated neighborhoods. And so this sort of ghettoized black people in the true use of the term ghettoized, right? To put into one area of town and relegate you there. It drove up housing costs for black people because they didn't have a lot of places they could live. And the quality of the housing was not good. And so they couldn't really develop in that way economically. So FHA redlining is one of those stories that you often hear. I feel like it's getting a little more well known. But a couple of stories you don't often hear are the stories of the way we built the federal highway system, in which, municipal leaders were handed millions and millions of dollars to put these highways where they wanted them to go. And guess what they could use? Eminent domain, right? So they went in, eminent domained whole black neighborhoods, and often kind of the black economic centers, the areas where business was really thriving, where people were putting together their business associations and civil society associations, and just kind of mowing them down and flinging people to the four winds. And this was only exacerbated by the rise of urban renewal, which James Baldwin called Negro removal. It was supposed to be slum clearance, right? But it was really taking people's homes away from them and sending them elsewhere to do what they might. And the truth is that we who understand the idea of culture and community, and we understand how that works, we should be the most understanding when someone's community is blown apart in that way and what that does to someone's soul. So we really look closely at those sorts of things. And then, of course, at the end, we're looking at issues like the drug war, the rise of the drug war and mass incarceration. And what we're looking at there is a situation in which now we're no longer talking about black Americans only, right? These are things that are affecting Americans of all kinds. But because the black community is still vulnerable, economically vulnerable, it really, really affects them. So we really shouldn't be surprised when we hear from the Black community about these issues, even though they're really just society-wide issues. We do talk about, of course, the Great Society and the effect of the perverse incentives, of the way that we have arranged our welfare state. I can talk about more about that. It's actually kind of shocking how much of a disincentive we have created for work and marriage through the welfare state. But we also complicate that to some extent too by talking about the way that the unions increase Black unemployment by not only keeping Blacks out of the unions, but also by pushing wages up such that manufacturing jobs left a lot faster than they would have otherwise, meaning that Black men kind of miss the window to get into those manufacturing jobs. So you're stuck back in manual labor without sort of that bridge into something better. And then throughout the book, we're kind of teaching you sort of what classical liberalism is. We do these little lessons in classical liberalism, little economic insights and things like that. And then we're also looking, of course, at solutions, right? And so we're talking about economic freedom for entrepreneurs. We're talking about educational freedom, which we think is a great justice issue of our time. We talk about criminal justice reform in detail. We talk about transitional justice, which deals with really institutional memory, properly memorializing the crimes that did occur against our Black neighbors, historically speaking. We think that conservatives and libertarians can help actually anchor those sorts of projects to reality and keep them focused on concrete, local, real occurrences of crime and not become too vague and abstract. Let's put it that way. And then finally, we look at a project that I'm particularly excited about, which is sort of the neighborhood stabilization movement. You see this with books like Toxic Charity by Robert Lupton, When Helping Hurts by Brian Fickert. I'm sure many of you have heard Bob Woodson. The Woodson Center is doing great work on Black ownership and gang intervention. And the sort of granddaddy of them all, John Perkins of the Christian Community Development Association. Neighborhood stabilization isn't a particularly political matter, right? When you're down on the street, what you're actually trying to do is surround neighbors with all the support they need to be empowered in their own vision for their own lives. And you want to treat them as subjects of exchange and not just as mere recipients. So it's really about dignity and doing philanthropy in a dignified way, as opposed to some of the toxic charity that we and many of our churches actually have been participating in. And so I'm going to stop there, but I want Marcus to expand on what I consider to be the heart of the book, which is, on the one hand, atrocities against Black Americans, but on the other hand, the amazing entrepreneurial legacy that we have from Black America. And you can see just the way that Black Americans have contended with the obstacles that they've had to deal with. So I'm going to invite Marcus up.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Rachel. These sections of the book are taken from chapters 4 and 6. And so in some ways, we've sort of gone through, right? We went through like chapters 1, 2, 3, skipped over 4, went to 5, and then concluded. But chapters 4 and 6 look at the atrocities that were committed against Black Americans. And one of the things we're trying to do in the book is we're trying to carve out what you might say is a third way of talking about sort of the American experiment. I get the sense from conservative friends, oftentimes the narrative that we get is that it's sort of a sort of patriotic America, triumphalism, like, America's exceptional, and there's not any sort of criticism of that is taken as like an assault upon American institutions and sort of the contributions that America made, especially in the 20th century. But on the other hand, we have sort of folks on the left, 1619 Project, etc., who are attacking sort of the American project and liberalism specifically as being sort of failed, right? The liberal experiment is being failed. And what the book offers, we argue, is a third way, a way that we can appreciate the American founding and our principles and recognize that past injustices did occur and that we're imperfect. We didn't live up to our liberal principles, the right to life, liberty, property, dignity for all individuals, the rule of just law, right? And so chapter 4 takes a look at the atrocities committed against Black Americans, and it begins really right after this sort of emancipation, talk a little bit about radical Reconstruction and the failure of Reconstruction to enable or to provide equal rights to Black Americans, political rights specifically. And we talk about the advent of Jim Crow, right? And usually when I talk to students about Jim Crow, they're like, we know, there was a black water fountain and a white water fountain. I'm like, no, that is not what we're talking about when we're talking about Jim Crow. Yes, separate but equal, plessy, all that exists. But this is much more damning than just you have to go drink from a different water fountain. 1873, 1877, we have redeemer governments across the South that take back over southern states, and in time they'll rewrite constitutions that pretty much exclude black Southerners from political life and parts of economic life as well. But they institute series of laws, and I just want to talk about a few of them sort of right now. The pig laws are sort of laws in which are called the pig laws because stealing a pig all of a sudden became a felony offense, right? Whereas it had before been treated sort of as a misdemeanor offense with fines attached, etc. We also see the advent of vagrancy laws, where if you could not prove, if you were in a town, and hypothetically this affected poor white men as well, it did, but disproportionately affected young black men specifically. If you were in a town and someone didn't know who you were, they could come up with you, or the sheriff could come up to you and they could ask you, can you prove that you're employed? Can you prove that you're part of the community? And if you couldn't provide $10 or proof of employment, you could be thrown in jail. And once you get thrown in jail, you get fined, okay? And so once you're fined, then we have these prisoners. What do we do with these prisoners? Well, what we'll do is they owe us money, so we'll lease them out in a system known as convict leasing to local firms, whether they be sort of the steel mines in Birmingham. We still have the name of, I'm blanking on his name now. All of a sudden, we still have the hall named after sort of the family, right, in Alabama. It'll come to me in a moment. But whether you go to the mines or whether you end up on farms, you'd be leased out, and then over a period of time, you would hypothetically pay back what you owed society, right, for your fine. Now remember, these people were arrested oftentimes for things that weren't even legitimate crimes, right? But now they're having to work off their sentences in these the sort of mines, etc. And oftentimes what happens in these camps is they're basically labor camps where you go and you work, and we don't want to diminish how horrible slavery was, but at least at a minimum, when folks were enslaved, there was a sort of desire to not kill your workers, right? You have an incentive, a perverse incentive, but an incentive to keep your workers at least alive. But in these camps where convicts were leased out, there's a title of a book called If One Dies, Get Another. And that was sort of the mentality. In some cases, you would have disease go rampant in these camps. You had 20 to 30% of the young men who were in these camps, some, once again, not all black, but predominantly black, disproportionately black, men who would die in the process of trying to work off their fines, etc. And convict leasing was widespread throughout the South. It took different forms in different states. B.B. Comer, by the way, the Comer family are the mines that I'm thinking about in Birmingham, Alabama. It's now the source of a music festival, Sloss Fest, I think, is right there near where that is. But nonetheless, point being, we had massive sort of numbers of people. We're talking tens of thousands of black men who were arrested for crimes, right? Hundreds of thousands who were arrested for crimes, and then tens of thousands who lost their lives, right? Because of this system, this unjust system of convict leasing. And so one of the things that we really have to grapple with in the book is that these liberal values weren't lived up to, right? We have to acknowledge that as a society, that we have these ideals about the right to life, liberty, property, but it's not as if emancipation happens and then we're good, right? Black Americans now have civil liberty. No. It's much longer. Jim Crow lasts all the way up until, I don't know what you want to say, 1964, 1965, right, etc. And so we have these, convict leasing is one example, atrocities that occur. We also have things like, the burning down of Black Wall Street, which more and more people are aware of today than were maybe 7 or 8 years ago when I began teaching at the University of Alabama, when I was first entrusted to my first summer class, right? And I assigned them a book called The Burning by Tim Madigan. Almost none of the students had ever heard of the burning of the assault upon Greenwood, which was known as Black Wall Street, of course, right, at the time. And the reason why we include this, as well as Colfax and a whole bunch of other sort of atrocities that were committed, is because we want to be honest with the reality that libertarians oftentimes are markets. Let's just establish markets and allow people to trade and exchange, and that'll solve the problem. Without the rule of just law, though, without the application of the rule of just law, the protection of the right to life, liberty, property, right, markets are not enough. Because what happened in Tulsa is that Black Americans did exactly what Rachel and I would have said you need to do, right? You need to go, you need to build community, you build civil society, you need to be the best entrepreneur you can possibly be. You want to be the best doctor you can possibly be, right? And white folks would come across the tracks to Greenwood, and they would go and get medical care. They would take their cars because the best mechanic was in Greenwood, and they would take their cars over there and have them serviced, etc. And so in Greenwood, we see, a thriving, prosperous, beautiful, flourishing community that has done exactly what Rachel and I are talking about, the liberal sort of vision of market, entrepreneurship, etc. Is exactly what Booker T. Washington told people to do, right? Put your bucket down, right? Work on meaningful skills, develop skills, become respectable, become a part of the community, and whites will acknowledge that your political rights in time. And unfortunately, what happened in Greenwood is that white envy emerges, right? Envy emerges, which we argue is incompatible with a liberal society. And what happens is that, I'm sure most of you know the story about Greenwood, but one day a young black man, sort of bumps into a white woman in an elevator. They seemingly had known one another. He gets accused of sexually assaulting her, attempting to sexually assault her. He flees. He gets arrested later on, Dick Rawling, and he gets thrown into the jail. The sheriff does the courageous work of trying to protect him from a white mob that was sort of, prodded by the local newspaper man who was associated with the KKK to lynch him. So there's this big white mob that comes, and the sheriff is standing courageously in between them. Black men specifically say, we've had enough, right? They get their guns. They come up to the courthouse to defend Dick Rawling. White men get their guns. They come up to the courthouse, and what happens next is that we have shots exchanged between the two groups. The sheriff is able to, and the police are able to basically get them divided. They go their separate ways. The black men return to Greenwood. The white men disappear seemingly that evening. And then the next morning, I don't remember exactly what time, but in the morning of June 1st, a whistle blares out. And then the sounds of a Gatling gun can be heard as white mobs, can only be described as white mobs, storm down into Greenwood and burn Greenwood to the ground, leaving hundreds dead, dislocating others. Many others are, of course, driven out of the town, and eventually they're sort of rounded up and brought in, put in pens and holding pens for a while, etc. The National Guard had been asked to come in to help with this. They actually stopped and got breakfast. They knew what was happening in Greenwood. They stopped, they got breakfast, etc. because the guy was unsure whether or not he wanted his men to be in the middle of this atrocity. So it's a horrible atrocity. So why do we include it in the book? Well, we had to grapple with that, right? We had to grapple with the fact that people, African Americans, attempted to create flourishing society, but they didn't have the protection of the rule of just law, right? They didn't have that, and so without that, markets aren't enough, right? We didn't live up to our liberal expectations in the case of Tulsa, and Tulsa is also a really great example in the book because it is a demonstration of transitional justice today. People have come back in, right? The community's trying to heal. They're digging up, right? They've dug up. They're trying to figure out how many people actually died, right, in this atrocity, and then trying to talk about it and heal together as a community. And one of the things that we emphasize is that there can be no reconciliation, right? There can be no reconciliation without sort of being held accountable, right? Without recognizing past injustice. You can't just be if you're in an abusive relationship, I've heard Rachel say this many times, if Devin and I were in an abusive relationship, right, and I'm beating Devin all the time, right, I can't just be like, Devin, Devin, we should just move on, right? Devin's not going to be like, yeah, we should just move on, right, that's fine. No, I had to acknowledge, my faults. We had to acknowledge, not necessarily in our case, right, none of us were alive at that time, but we had to acknowledge what happened. We had to discuss what happened. We tried to address what occurred, the failings, etc. And then as a community, and then once again, transitional justice is very concrete. We're looking at the Tulsa Massacre, right? Let's acknowledge that. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about things that affect us as a community today, and then let's heal. And so Tulsa provides not only an example, right, of how markets aren't enough, right, without the rule of just law, but it also provides an opportunity for us to talk about transitional justice. The other chapter that I wrote most of was the chapter on black entrepreneurship. And so we juxtapose the chapter on sort of atrocities against blacks with the chapter on that's extraordinarily hopeful, right? It ends with the civil rights movement. It ends with T.R.M. Howard giving a speech in Atlanta, and Rosa Parks sitting there listening to his speech, finding it so moving about the murder of Emmett Till that she, just a few weeks later, she was like, that was one of the last speeches I'd heard that I was like, yes, we're doing this, right? The NAACP, I'm going to go, and I'm going to refuse to give up my seat on the bus, right? And so that's where we end the chapter, which is not generally where the civil rights movement, when we talk about the civil rights movement, that's where it begins, right? And there's not a lot of talk about the time before. And we did that specifically because my students oftentimes come to class and they say they know about emancipation, they know about Plessy maybe, different water fountains, and then they know about Martin Luther King. And that's the breadth of their high school education largely on civil rights. And one of the things that I tried to get across to them is that civil rights is a product of the successes of 1964, the successes of 1965. We shouldn't just be like, okay, the answer is not just like, okay, government finally recognized these people's rights. Government did finally recognize these people's rights, and I'm happy that they did in 1964 and 1965. But the reality is that it took a lot of hard work by Black Americans to get to the point by which they could achieve those successes, right? They could force government, basically, to acknowledge their rights. And so this chapter traces the development of civil society, traces the development of fraternal organizations, based on the research of my graduate school advisor, Dr. David Beto. I'd say one of the great libertarian historians, who's done a great deal of work on this. It talks about the way in which the Black Elks, right, formed an organization where people, the Black Elks is just a fraternal society, but it's way more than that because it allows Black men an opportunity, and Black women, there are, the fraternal societies are the equivalent, right, for women as well, to come in and they learn, they form contacts, etc. They also, though, train lawyers because they had to fight for their names, because the white fraternal societies don't like the fact that the Black fraternal societies want to be called the Black Elks, right? And so as a result, we actually get the first, years later, you get NAACP lawyers. Where do they get their start? They get their start actually in these fraternal societies fighting for, right, this sort of fighting against this idea that the white fraternal societies own the names. And so we see these organizations, they provide so much. They provide insurance, they provide life insurance, they provide some form of disability, like if you get sick on the job. They provide that, but they also provide classes on civics and education and what are your rights and what are you, how do you participate in government, and they teach people about the Constitution and about the Bill of Rights and about America's history, both, the history that we would have learned and also sort of the dark history, right, that many of their forefathers had gone through. And what we see is that those organizations are combined with the Black church and those other civil society organizations are the foundation for the civil rights movement. And what we argue in the book is that you don't get a civil rights movement, the successes of 1955 and onward, without the hard work, the foundation that was built by those mutual aid societies, by those civil societies. In 1905, late 19th century, early 20th century, they tried. They tried to desegregate the trolley systems, and they failed in those years. They tried to use their economic leverage to do that, and they just didn't. I think they just didn't have enough economic leverage, right, in 1905. But 50 years later, right, 50 years later, there are other things that have changed as well as media and other things. But 50 years later, you have the NAACP, right, which has worked for, at that point, some 30 some odd years, right, to achieve equality through the courts. You have a series of Black lawyers. You have other civil society organizations. And when, Rosa Parks is successful in Montgomery, right, at helping desegregate, right, through the boycott, the bus system, when they look back and you look at the donors to the causes, they're people, the Black Elks, right, the fraternal societies. They're providing the money, the lawyers, etc., that undergird the civil rights movement. And so our story about the civil rights movement and about Black liberation is that, yes, African Americans achieved liberation, in 1964 and 1965 to a certain extent, although the job wasn't done, I'd argue. But it wasn't just like government gave them their rights. No, it's part of a long, long process in which Black Americans took those rights. They told government, right, and they told Americans, we're going to fight for those rights, and they had to build their sort of society. And the way in which they did it was through the very things that oftentimes are criticized by the left. They did it through markets. They did it through entrepreneurship. They did it through civil society. They did it through organizations, right? They did it through, by using sort of those things that Rachel and I, think are so important to sort of prosperity, etc. And so that's the lesson that we sort of leave that chapter with, is that, Black civil rights achievements are really the product of a much longer process, and that to condemn the marketplace would be to condemn the very means by which Black Americans ultimately succeeded in gaining liberation. So.
Okay, should we just open it up for questions?
For the benefit of viewers, if any questioners or commenters could come to the microphone and identify yourself.
You want to sit right here? Yeah. Yes. And just indicate if there's one or the other that you specifically want to ask.
I'm hoping for both.
Yes, if you would.
You guys should line up if you want to do questions.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question was on a comment that was made in your portion of the lecture where you said that conservatives and libertarians can make some of these structures sort of into reality. And I have some reservations about that, especially as a social conservative, because I find myself disagreeing with libertarians, especially on that front. And I think with sort of the Fusionist project, a lot of that has not been entirely successful. So do you think that that alliance is practical in the long run, or?
Well, okay, so I'll clarify what I said and that what I was specifically thinking of.
Okay.
You're the one who knows a lot about Fusionism, so I'll let Marcus take that one. But what I was referring to is specifically the projects within transitional justice, which means that transitional justice is about a lot of things, but one of the things it's about is institutional memory. And so it's in our own local communities, right? And so the point is, you have the left talking a lot about reckoning with our past, but they can sometimes become so abstract with all of the different kinds of heteropatriarchy, capitalist oppression, right, or whatever, that they're trying to deal with. The term social justice, it loses all meaning in some sense, right? It's just like something is wrong, and so that's not very helpful because you can't actually address anything, right? So the advantage of transitional justice is that you're looking at concrete crimes. So you're looking at concrete local situations in your own towns or universities, and you're going back and you're thinking about how can we just tell this story and just honor those who survived or whose lives were lost with our history, because that's part of the healing process. Right. And so that's what I meant when I said conservatives and liberals can anchor those to reality. Because I was saying that they will focus on the concreteness of the issue and not let it kind of get taken over by all of these vague ideas about various forms of oppression. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because we're looking at property crime, we're looking at crime against the person bodily, we're looking at violations of freedom of contract, and cases in which we didn't protect you with the just law, with the rule of just law. So that's what matters, right? That's sort of the classical liberal focus. So that's what I was talking about, but the broader question of fusionism, I don't know how much you want to...
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that, we're talking about real injustice when we're talking about these things. We're not talking about something like social justice. This is concrete. These are clear examples historically of just injustice that conservatives and libertarians agree, these are violations of property rights, violation of the right to life, and so I think we can agree on that. And I think the goal would be just this can go nuts, and we're much better being in the room than not being in the room. Right. I think that's something that conservatives and libertarians need to recognize. We need to be part of this conversation, as Rachel said, to kind of keep it grounded. But I think also for it to be productive, because without everybody, without people from all different spectrums, we're not going to have actual healing. We're just going to have one side chastising another, and that's not beneficial at all. It probably just drives a wedge further between us. As far as fusionism and sort of, you said you were a social conservative. I'm a classical liberal or libertarian. So I guess it depends on what you want to achieve. You know what I mean? If you want the state to, if you want to use the state to promote families, if you want to use the state to, intervene in markets significantly on some type of social sort of top-down central planning. Then I don't know about the future of fusionism. I think the future of fusionism depends upon where conservatism goes over the course of the next 6 years, the next 2 years perhaps, and so I'm not sure that libertarians really want to work with I'm not sure libertarians want to work with integralists. I don't think libertarians want to work with people who want to use the state to do the very things that Rachel and I talk about as being so damaging to community and to family, etc. We don't need top-down solutions. What we need is to empower individuals and families and communities so that they can address these issues themselves. So I don't know about the Fusionist project. I still think that libertarians have more in common and conservatives have more in common with one another than they do with progressives, because progressives are high on the state. Okay, they believe that the state can solve our problems, and conservatives are at least. Still, some of them are still somewhat grounded to reality that it cannot actually solve many of these problems, and they're suspicious of the state and technocrats and the administrative state, and so I think there's still common ground there, right? But I don't know. It's a really difficult question for me to answer because I want to say like there's a future for us together, my friend. But but I'm not sure if that's the case or not. Do you want to follow up?
No, I mean I think that's a fair point, especially on the matter of using, like you said, using the state for some of those policies. I guess it's more my concern of what that would lead to in the long run is sort of like we can't use the state, for example, to like. Would you support that, for example, the state instituting a ban on abortion?
Personally, I am pro-life. I think that life begins at conception. I'm actually also agnostic, so I believe that, not because of my religious convictions, but because I think it's pretty clear. My wife and I are having a baby boy, July 21st, and when he was, and this is maybe too personal, but like, we had an ultrasound done when he was 8 weeks old, and he was bebopping around and moving his hands, and like it's just incredible. I mean, we didn't know he was a he at that point, but it's incredible. I mean, it's really difficult for me. Like, I'm an empiricist. Like, this is a human life. Like, it's pretty. I mean, you don't even need God for that. I mean, I say that in this room, but like it's just clear. It's just obvious. So like, would I support that? It looks like Roe is going to be overturned. And so I don't have a problem with returning it to state legislatures to make decisions about what is best for those state legislatures or for those states and the people in there. I think that's called democracy in action, which the left claims to support and like and love. And so like let people in the states make their decisions. And if you want to get an abortion and you live in Alabama, you can go. I'm sure there'll be organizations in civil society that will bus you from Alabama to Oregon or from Alabama to wherever to get an abortion. So would I support that? That's a really difficult question, probably one of the most difficult ones. I would support it, but be very concerned about like enforcement. I don't want to create like a new war on drugs in which we go after moms. Like that doesn't sound appealing at all. So like I think that we have some really difficult questions to answer that we haven't answered because of Roe, that we should have settled 40 years ago through the course of the state legislatures, that we've lost that time now. And this is the position that RGB basically took as well, that like we lost the opportunity to sort of settle this through civil society and discourse. And so I don't know where that goes. I think it's the most difficult question in our political, it's difficult because we have just different priors. Like the left does not see it as a human life, right? So it's hard to, we fundamentally disagree. We have two conflicting rights claims, right? And so it makes it really, really hard. And so I think we have to, if they overturn Roe, we have to engage in this in a way that's humble and civil and try to recognize that, we have different points of view, but hopefully we can come together in a civil way to resolve it. I don't know if that's a good enough answer.
No, that's perfect.
That's all I got.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That's all I got. So. Come on.
Hi, I'm Andrew. So I think one of the things you guys talked about is kind of, the need to sort of reconcile and sort of look back on and recognize a lot of like the atrocities that have been done and sort of like in Tulsa, for example. And one of the arguments that you hear a lot of times, especially from like the left, is when you look at like discrepancies and like social economic discrepancies between races, they point to that as like the historical redlining or these atrocities and such that have been done to, for example, like African Americans and such. And so thus they propose like reparations or these kind of like statist big government approaches to reconciling that with kind of payments through reparations or, just all these kind of like welfare state and such. So what is the classical liberal approach to that while also still recognizing the damage that has been done?
So I think we're extremely clever in our answer to reparations. You can judge and tell me whether we are or not. But we are actually fine with the idea. So Japanese Americans who suffered internment during World War II, ultimately during the Reagan administration, they were ultimately given reparations of around $20,000 or something like that, which is not anywhere close to like the amount of loss that most Japanese Americans experienced during World War II, but it at least was an acknowledgement of past injustice that was carried out by the state, right? The state wronged these people. And in the case of African Americans, we can talk about, we don't even have to go all the way back to slavery, we can just go back to Jim Crow, right? Like that's within living memory. Like there are people who lived through Jim Crow. And we can identify people who faced injustice, real injustice, and we can say, okay, you were harmed by this, right? There's no doubt that capital accumulation, we're not even talking about the stolen labor of 300 years, but capital accumulation, but also like the ways in which They were harmed by redlining, the plowing down of neighborhoods, to the federal highway system, etc. So we are sympathetic to the idea of addressing those past injustices and forcing the government to pay for them, not taxpayers. So how do we do that? Well, we propose, like, we've got all this federal land that is unused. Why not sell the federal land and then set up some type of, reparation system with those resources? And Rachel can talk a little bit more about the specific ideas we have for that. But it should be the government that pays folks, not American taxpayers, right? Like, how much land does the government own out west?
$2 trillion worth.
So, I mean, that's, this, as a libertarian, the land needs to be in the private sector anyways. This is a double, right? We can address past injustice, and we can get this land out of the hands of the government, put it into more useful and purposeful sort of usage.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, I think the complicated story we want to tell, or the more nuanced story, is to say, yes, you have systemically racist policies that get the ball rolling with housing, right, and neighborhoods. But what that does is it creates an isolated, ghettoized area of concentrated poverty, which creates, and along with the Great Society, all of the problems that we see with family structure, with high levels of crime, right, with the change in the culture towards education, for instance. That's not Black America, that's inner city concentrated poverty, right? 80% of Black Americans are not poor. They're living in the suburbs, middle class, majority middle class. And so we have to remember that, right? We shouldn't always be saying this is a Black problem. It's really a poverty problem. And so what we're doing is we're acknowledging the point about the racist origins, but we're also acknowledging the conservative point about cultural problems like fatherlessness, which of course you also see in poor white rural communities, right? And we're saying, yeah, because one causes the other, so it's just a causal chain. But I think the problem with the left's approach is they want to go back and do like anti-racist training or something. But that was the non-proximate cause, right? The proximate cause now is dads don't know what to do, right? Or kids can't talk to their dads because their dad's incarcerated, or whatever it might be. And so if we want to address it, we need to address that. We need to address the proximate cause. So we actually acknowledge a lot about the points about culture there. And then to go back to the point about reparations, the real remaining disparity right now is wealth. It's not even really income. Black incomes are going up. They're moving along, apace. It's really wealth. And some of that is actually just the difference between there being like spectacularly wealthy white people, like Bill Gates or something. We don't have as many Black people who have gotten there yet. So it may just be a matter of the passage of time, right? Another generation or two. But if we want to build Black wealth, then any sort of a scheme, and this is obviously a little bit of a pipe dream, right? But we want to acknowledge the genuine injustice, acknowledge that it would be the resources of the state that would be put to use for any kind of reparations. And we would want that to go towards something that would do a good job of building Black wealth, whether that's supporting Black banking, for instance, or low interest loans for entrepreneurs, something that's putting money into the wealth generating activities of the Black community. And it would be like limited, right? And I could go into more details about that. I don't think it would be totally race specific. So while the idea that we put forward would include all African Americans and all Native Americans, it could also be means tested for poor whites. I mean, we have to remember that poor white people were deeply, deeply affected, and Latinos, right? The Latino community was affected by the building of the highways. Poor Black whites were affected by the backwardness of the Southern economy, right? And so we want to do justice to that too by including them. So we're seeing it really as an economic problem.
Yeah,
Do you want to add?
I just want to say the other thing is like the difference between if a reparation scheme came forward from the left and was insanely redistributive, like we wouldn't be on board, right? And we also don't think that reparations is an actual solution.
It's not like a silver bullet or something.
Whereas I feel like some people think like, well, we'll have reparations and then we'll have like healing, and it's a way more complicated and complex problem. But I think acknowledging it in this way would be a way in which to recognize past injustice while also using the funds from the actual perpetrators, the state, and not the individuals who are alive today, right? Who didn't play a part in that, right? We also often hear that from conservatives, right? Like, I wasn't alive, so why should I pay for it?
Right.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else?
So you talked about how government has the ability to lay the groundwork, right? But it can't actually make things, I don't want to say equal, but workable, right? So it's necessary but insufficient. So you could have free markets, but then if the culture isn't put together properly, it won't work. Okay. How do you recommend going forward and building an actual sustainable culture? Because it's quite hard. One, like you have the fallen man view, but a culture to some degree has to be exclusive, right? And I wouldn't say hostility towards outgroups is necessary, but you can't include everyone, right? Because once you include everyone, then you don't have a culture. You just have everyone in a group, right? So what are some exclusive pillars that we could make a culture that would include white and black people, right? But that would function.
Well, I think I understand your question. You know, I'm a little obsessive about this, and I talk about it a lot, so I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself. But I do think that the neighborhood stabilization movement is actually a great resource for this culture building. And part of the reason for that is because it's working in communities where the culture has been sort of the most broken down, right? It's become the most destabilized. So areas in which you've even lost family structure, right? Employment networks are shot to hell. You know, you might be on a street with almost no one who has a job. Well, how did I get my first job? My friend Jeremy told me they were hiring over at the roast beef place, so I went over and got it, right? That's how you get a job, right? And when I applied to grad school, how did I do that? Well, my professor told me what to do, and she read my paper 5 different times, and then, then I applied to grad school. So we take those kinds of networks for granted. And I have to admit, I'm just going to say this explicitly, even with Marcus in the room, the agnostic. The neighborhood stabilization movement is a Christian movement. I mean, it just is. John Perkins, Brian Fickert, Bob Lupton, and Bob Whitson are Christians. And they are writing the books on this stuff. They are the leaders in this conversation. And I was talking to Lucas, who's the head of Love the Lou. I was talking to him a couple weeks ago. Love the Lou is a neighborhood stabilization organization that I'm involved with in St. Louis. And Lucas has been in the neighborhood for 11 years, and I was talking to him about popularizing the model, right, the philanthropic model of being on the ground, long-term, hyper-local, personal presence, real love, surrounding the neighbor, bringing the resources in, not asking them to go out, right, presenting the alternative life right there on the block, building the community garden, building the wood shop, building the lawnmower shop. It's on the street. So that the 13-year-old walking by goes, I want to make some money on a Saturday, right? And all of a sudden they've got job skills and they know how to handle things. And so that's the model. And I'm talking to him about this model, very ground up, very decentralized, right? Very spontaneous order, which we love. Emergent order, go Hayek. But he looked me dead in the eye and he said, Rachel, if you're not a Christian, you're not going to do it. He goes, I've had my van stolen 6 times. 3 people died on the corner in 2016. Were murdered on the corner. Now I'm moving into a new neighborhood, and they hate me. The people on Enright love me, but the people in this neighborhood don't know me, and they hate me, they don't trust me, and nothing I've been doing for the last 11 years means anything to them, right? So why does he love them? Why does he stick with it? Why does he deal with all the mistrust and the haranguing? Why does he do it? For Jesus. He does it for Jesus Christ. That's why he does it, right? He has a heart of love for these people that includes a lot of self-sacrifice. Okay, and so I think we just have to admit that there may be a real special role for the Christians, right, to lay down their lives. Now, everybody who's involved with Love the Lou doesn't have to do what Lucas does. Don't get me wrong. I'm not asking you all to move to the inner city if you really love people. I'm not saying that. What Lucas does is a special calling. He's like a missionary, right? But he calls on all of us. He's pulling on our networks because we're the well-networked people, and his neighbors are experiencing network poverty. Right, so we're coming in and hanging out with the dad. Well, not me, but the dads are hanging out with the dads, right, to mentor them. We're mentoring the inner city entrepreneurs. We're helping them deal with the weird tax regulations, right, and figure out QuickBooks and all this kind of stuff. And so there are many of us who can be involved without that level of self-sacrifice, but we all have to feel that we're called to make a sacrifice to lift up people whose lives have been destroyed by our foolishness, the foolishness of the United States government, along with other issues, but that one is a major one, right? And so I do think there's a real culture there, and you see it. So in the book we describe, for instance, the person of peace, and this is a person, they're kind of like an anchored person in the community who's really trusted by the neighbors. They've lived there all their lives. They want to redeem the neighborhood, but they haven't been empowered, right? And they haven't been encouraged. And so Lucas finds these people and he lifts them up, right? And then he introduces them to one another. And then they're ready to go, right? And Bob Lupton talks about this, right, in his book, where he opens the secondhand store instead of giving out the Christmas shoe boxes, so parents can come and buy the presents for themselves because that's more dignified. And then what happens? The women start wanting to run the store. So what do we see in this culture? We see that there's a real humility to the people who are involved. There's a Christ-like love and self-sacrifice, but there's also a real entrepreneurial spirit, an honoring of the creativity and the vision of the neighbors themselves, right? And a willingness to step back from my own agenda and subordinate it to their vision for their own neighborhood. And so I see a lot of elements there that really form a very particular way of life, and it's quite beautiful. And weirdly, it's very apolitical. So Carlene, who mentors the students, is black, but she's like a big Republican, very, very conservative, okay? Some of the other people who are working in the gardens, for instance, are like St. Louis University biology professors who have, much more, they're Christians, but they're much more progressive in their politics. But guess what? Nobody talks about any of that. Because when you get down on the street level, that's just not what you're doing. We're not arguing about that part, right? Sure. And so we're able to work together. And it's really an interesting cultural kind of milieu, I have to say.
Okay, so it seems like you're saying that the culture is ready, but it needs to be activated by some sort of infrastructure above it. And then once the infrastructure is ready, then there will be a solution? Is that the idea?
Well, I want to be really careful with the phrase above it, because you know how we feel about central planning. I know what you mean, though.
There's culture, and then there's infrastructure.
Yeah. And I think the infrastructure is really in our philanthropic models that are in our churches, our nonprofit administration programs, right, our social work programs. You need to get that model flipped in the people who are the ones who are going to feel called to that kind of work. There's actually, Brian Fickert runs something called the Chalmers Center. And the Chalmers Center, you can send your church mission board there, and they'll train them on how to flip their philanthropic models, stop doing the Christmas shoeboxes, and start doing the really dignifying form of philanthropy. So I think that's the sort of infrastructure we want to create, and then just let that beautiful emergent order happen, because each local situation is different.
So do you think sorry if I'm going too long, but do you think the government could work with that flipped model, or no? You think it has to come from churches and other social groups?
I don't.
I would not trust a bureaucrat.
Here, you want to stand at the mic for the people?
So surprise. I would not trust the bureaucrat or the central planners with this. They're not close enough to the ground. Right? It's the use of knowledge in society. F.A. Hayek, I think, the greatest economic article written in the 20th century. You had to get close to the problem to know the people, to know the needs, right? To develop the culture organically. It cannot come.
And government, it's face to face.
It's face to face.
Personal presence.
Here's one of the other things we emphasize in the book is government destroyed many of these communities, but government can destroy very quickly, but it doesn't have the tools or the means by which to actually create vibrant culture, community, family. It can't do that. That work has to be done by individuals on the ground, right? Working together in community through fellowship, right, to actually build those institutions that will actually lead to flourishing. So, no, not from the top down, not from the state.
I think the only sense in which we would, I guess, think about at least policy would just be forms of deregulation. Just getting out of people's ways, right? Letting the hair braiders braid hair, letting the barbers cut hair. Maybe things like economic opportunity zones, like Tim Scott. Will those work if we close the gap of sort of the bandwidth of the community members? Maybe. I'm always for taxing people less, which I guess is what he's doing, right, in those zones. But do I think that's really going to be the way that it happens? No, it's the bottom-up stuff that's really going to make the difference. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Anybody else? Yeah. Can you come up to the mic? Yes. Because I think we have people listening online.
Yeah, just to piggyback on the question. So, it's interesting. How do you incentivize if the churches are probably at least one of the superheroes that can kind of really make it happen. How do you incentivize churches, especially given that the church, unfortunately, is not probably one of the most popular places for young people, millennials, these days?
Yeah, really interesting question. So first, I always make the point that actually Black Americans are the most religious demographic in America. It's true that church attendance is going down among young people. Remember that a lot of young people go back to church when they have kids. Okay, but that's just kind of a pattern that's always been true. But even though that's also happening among Black millennials, they still are more religious than white millennials in terms of things like prayer, believing in God, reading the Bible, etc. So there is still, I think, some momentum there to take advantage of. But I also think it's really interesting to notice, I don't know if you are in a church milieu or if you've noticed this, but the idea that some of the ways we've been doing like missions and philanthropy, that it's really bad, that's actually much more common now, right? Have you guys, like, we're kind of critiquing like our short-term mission trips where we go paint the school for the third time, you know what I mean? And everybody's like, yeah, we know. And so I actually feel like culturally among those who are religious, you actually kind of know this, and then it's a question of, okay, but how do I change the model? Right? So we all kind of know that we're doing things in a toxic way. How do we do it in a non-toxic way? And so I think, groups like the Chalmers Center, bringing in church mission boards and training them is really, really helpful. The Acton Institute has a great series of videos called Poverty Cure, where you can actually take, it's like 4 churches to go through and sort of relearn how they think about these issues. And so, I believe in the church in spite of everything, right? Because deeply imperfect and so much healing that needs to happen. But I do believe that Jesus is at work in his church. And so I see those little sparks that give me hope that we can turn things around. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, I feel like the Black church has always been like the backbone, traditionally, for empowerment, economics, but it's, unfortunately, you don't have those leaders probably well represented throughout government, throughout leadership in this country. So it becomes almost a lot for the leaders of religious communities to have to say, well, I just want to be in my sphere, create change, but I don't want to have to also be in Congress 3 days of the week too.
Right.
That's a lot.
Yeah, right. And so that's actually a great point. So I would love it if the churches would not be focusing on policy. I mean, Christians can focus on policy because they're called to do policy. But pastors, right, who are thinking about the way, or who are leading their churches, I would rather actually that they be focused on the pastoral work of neighborhood stabilization, and actually they should take advantage of the businessmen sitting in the pews to work on the kind of economic development side of things. I actually think there's a lot of Christian businessmen who are showing up to church, sitting in their pew, feeling kind of useless, because we talk in church like you're here to come into my building and do volunteer work, or be a greeter, or write me a check, or something, right? But that's not actually speaking to any of the gifts that business people have been given, right? And so if you're saying, hey, you know taxes, can you help this inner city entrepreneur? All of a sudden, it's my gifts that are being used for the kingdom of God. And I think it's actually quite sad to think about many of the people who are sitting in the pew thinking, well, I guess my job is just secular and it doesn't do anything for the kingdom of God. Now, of course, I want them to think of the work that they do every day, Monday through Friday, as contributing to the kingdom of God as well. But the idea that they could give to someone in this really wonderful way through their skill set, I think could be incredibly powerful in our churches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of awaken a whole group of men that are maybe feeling somewhat lackadaisical spiritually.
And women.
Say it again?
And women, business women.
And business women, but the reason I say men is because the church can often, except for the pastor, right? The church can often have a lot of activity from the women, with men kind of going to church because their wife wants them to, sometimes, right? And I mean, I've talked to pastors about this. I have so many women who their husbands don't even come to church, or they're not really leading in a spiritual way. And I think that sometimes that's because they're not even really being asked to identify with the kingdom of God in terms of the things that matter in their lives, right? And so this could be a real way to make that connection.
Thanks.
Thanks. Also a great question.
Well, Marcus and Rachel, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation from both of you. Thank you for participation by the audience with your excellent questions. And we have copies of, George, am I on camera? We have copies of their book available here, being sold at reasonable prices, I'm sure.
$18 on Amazon.com. Very approachable, both in terms of readability and price.
All right. So make sure you get a copy before you leave. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.